This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. At first glance, America looks like it's in trouble. The vast majority of Americans think their country is heading in the wrong direction, and American politics seems permanently paralysed by hyper-partisan division. Nonetheless, even if the optics aren't great, 2020 was actually a pretty good year for American power, for at least three reasons. First, basically every one of America's geostrategic rivals have declined in one way or another. Second, the US dollar has reasserted itself as the world's reserve currency, despite speculation to the contrary. And third, while American politics clearly isn't working brilliantly, the midterms might be a death knell for Donald Trump, who plausibly represented the biggest existential threat to America's political system. So let's start by looking at America's geostrategic rivals. With perhaps the exception of North Korea, America's three largest strategic rivals are probably China, Russia, and Iran. Every single one of these countries has seen a fall in their geopolitical standing in 2022. Let's start with China. Despite a good start to the pandemic, China's zero-COVID policy has crippled the economy and sparked the largest protests on the Chinese mainland since the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. It looks like the CCP are now easing restrictions, but while this might ease some of the pressure, it's not a risk-free strategy. Less than 40% of over 80s have been fully vaccinated, and China's Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines are less effective against Omicron than their mRNA equivalents used by most Western countries. A sudden surge in COVID cases could overwhelm China's fragile health system, especially in rural areas. Even if China does successfully ditch zero COVID, China's economic prospects don't look anywhere near as good as they did even a couple of years ago. The CCP are currently struggling to contain a housing crash, and their recent crackdowns on various industries have spooked foreign investors, who have been offloading Chinese debt and equities at record rates. While the CCP still claim they're on track for 4% growth this year, analysts are increasingly skeptical of China's official GDP data, and Bloomberg estimates that China's real growth this year will be about 2%, behind the US's 2.8%. While this is one of the more pessimistic forecasts, the IMF predicts 3.2% growth this year, followed by 2.7% in 2023. There's nonetheless a consensus that China's economy is decelerating. On top of that, it looks like Biden's recent sanctions, especially those on US persons working in China's semiconductor industry, have been remarkably effective. So far, China hasn't responded, presumably for fear of further sanctions, and America's tech supremacy remains intact. Anyway, on to Russia. For obvious reasons, 2022 has been a terrible year for Russia geopolitically. Its military has turned out to be a paper tiger, its economy is crumbling, and it's become an international pariah. While the Pentagon has sent more military aid to Ukraine than any other country, it's cost the US less than 0.5% of GDP, and kneecapping one of your largest geostrategic rivals for less than $70 billion is actually a pretty good deal. Finally, Iran. While little progress has been made on the nuclear deal, this year the Ayatollah's regime has looked less stable than ever before. The protests in Iran have been raging for 3 months, and things are beginning to look a lot like 1979. There was a general strike last month, and politically significant constituencies, including oil workers and the occasional parliamentarian, have expressed their support for protests. While no one can say for sure, protests as deadly as Iran's usually end in revolution or civil war, and it's very possible that the Ayatollahs will be gone by the end of 2023. This would obviously be great news for the US, because, well, the Ayatollahs don't really like the Americans. So those are the strategic rivals. On to the second reason 2022 has been good for the US, the continued dominance of the dollar. Since basically the end of World War II, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency. This basically means that it's the go-to currency for at least a plurality of international transactions, and financial institutions hold lots of dollars in reserve for this reason. Now, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency has some downsides. For example, some analysts think that it's contributed to the death of American manufacturing by overvaluing the dollar and making American exports less competitive. However, it has its massive upsides. For starters, the dollar's strength massively increases Americans' purchasing power internationally, protecting them from inflation. This is one of the reasons that America's inflation rate is below that of Europe, despite the fact that America's economy is growing far faster than Europe's, which would usually exacerbate inflation. But perhaps the main advantage of the dollar's reserve currency status is that it allows America and the American government to borrow loads of money, because, well, there's always demand for dollars. Before 2022, and even at the start of the year, there was speculation that the dollar's dominance was coming to an end. The share of US dollar reserves held by central banks fell to 59% at the end of 2020, its lowest level in 25 years, and the dollar continued to decline during the start of 2021. There were rumours at the beginning of this year that the Saudis were considering denominating oil sales in yen instead of dollars, and when the ruble hit a 7-year high earlier this year, there were even reports that Putin was considering backing the currency with a combination of oil and gold in an attempt to usurp the dollar. In late 2021, when crypto was riding high, there was even some talk in corners of the internet that Bitcoin could become the world's next reserve currency, especially if it proved a successful hedge against inflation. In hindsight, all those ideas look, well, a bit silly. Crypto has proved a terrible hedge against inflation, and the FTX scandal has invited further regulation of the industry. Unsurprisingly, Putin hasn't experimented with a new petrogold currency, not least because the Russian economy can't handle it. As we mentioned earlier, the CCP's erratic regulation and China's economic slowdown have spooked foreign investors, and the yen has declined sharply against the dollar this year. On the other hand, as turbulence has swept through the global economy, investors have returned to the dollar in their droves, and the dollar is now at a 20-year high. Clearly, the dollar is still the world's reserve currency, and 2022 has demonstrated that, if anything, it's even stronger than previously imagined. Third and finally, Donald Trump. Now, before we get into this, a disclaimer. We try to be neutral on this channel, and this section isn't intended as a partisan attack against Trump or the Republicans. Nonetheless, even if you think Trump's politics are great and you agree with his policies, it's hard to deny that, since the 2020 election, he's been the single greatest threat to America's political system. He's refused to accept the results of an election, contrary to all the available evidence, and pro-Trump candidates have consistently questioned the legitimacy of America's electoral processes. Again, regardless of your politics, it should be uncontroversial to say that this represents a threat to America's democracy, because, well, a functioning democracy requires losers' consent. Unfortunately for Trump, his hand-picked candidates performed conspicuously badly at the midterms, and it now looks like Ron DeSantis is the favourite for the Republican candidacy in 2024. Even if you don't like DeSantis' policies, he's not the election denier that Trump is, and that's good news for America's political system. Obviously, it's important not to overstate the case here. America's politics is still beset by angry bipartisanship, and a significant faction of the electorate still think the 2020 election was stolen. Nonetheless, American democracy is still safer than it was last year, and if the US can keep the show on the road, it'll probably remain the world's preeminent superpower for years to come. And what more American way is there to celebrate this than with capitalism? Because Nebula has a sale on right now. You've heard me tell you about Nebula before, but there's a big sale on right now. So if you've ever considered signing up, now's the time. Essentially though, Nebula is the streaming service we built with a bunch of your other favourite creators. Over there, we've posted a bunch of exclusive full-length TLDR videos which will never come to YouTube, but you'll also find a load of our normal videos early and ad-free there too. As I said, it's not just us either. There's tons of other amazing creators too, which makes it astonishing you can get all of this exclusive and ad-free content for less than $1 a month. Normally, people sell you things as being less than a cup of coffee. This is less than a bottle of water, and a fraction of what other streaming services are charging. Services which don't directly support independent creators. This crazy good offer is only available right now, and it's only possible through our Nebula Curiosity Stream bundle. Essentially, if you sign up to Curiosity Stream for the crazy low price of $11.59 a year, then you get free access to Nebula as long as you're a member. That's right, 2 platforms for less than $1 a month. And CuriosityStream is awesome. It contains absolutely boatloads of high-quality documentaries on all kinds of topics I know TLDR viewers will love. So if you want both for less than $1 a month, then the link's down below. And if you've ever considered signing up to support TLDR, now's the cheapest time to do so. So thank you.